risking a punch on the nose probably by quoting Michael Gove when he was Secretary of State for Justice. But considering the title of the debate that Bernard's given us for tonight, I think it's probably relevant. Michael Gove said in the Tory party conference in 2015, "Now, let us take reforming zeal into the dark corners of our prison system and bring redemption to those who were lost. Let us ensure our prisons are places of hard work, rigorous education and high ambition. Let us free our prisons from drugs and violence and make them places of decency and dignity, hope and purpose. Let us ensure above all that criminal justice policy serves the cause of social justice for all."
Sounds like treason.
It does, yes. It's not quite tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. But the reason for quoting that is that the title that Bernard's given us for tonight is "Criminal Justice is the Right More Visionary Than the Left?" Bernard will introduce a discussion that attempts to get away from the cliches of reform and examine what the left can offer that is distinctive. Bernard has particular experience and wisdom in this area, having been a probation officer for 35 years from 1970 to 2005. He's currently an associate lecturer, I believe, at Solent University in the School of Business, Law and Communications. He, for 9 years, was responsible for leading a Home Office programme developing projects for offenders and discharged prisoners, and chaired offending behaviour reviews in the Isle of Wight prisons. So, Bernard, you're extremely well versed in these matters, and we're looking forward to your message tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Graham, and thank you for coming out on this night. Which it was that's irony you mentioned Michael Gove, because that certainly rings with some of the things I was going to mention, and but it feels like, just the conversation with John at the beginning, talking about criminal justice when Trump's coming as president and we've got Brexit and one thing and another, and I listened to Jeremy Corbyn this morning, and that really was a bit of a message for tonight, because the way I was going to start this until I heard Jeremy Corbyn this morning was, when was criminal justice or crime and law and order last a focus in an election? Do you remember elections which talked about law and order, crime and keeping crime off our streets? Not really talked about much probably in the last 15 years or so, probably quite interestingly. Certainly not asked and talked about by Jeremy Corbyn this morning, or should I say by John Humphreys this morning in question. So it isn't a matter that currently is sort of got people bubbling away. And it's not headlines in newspapers anymore, is it? I've got to remember, those awful faces on the front of the Daily Express, the face of crime in Britain today, and it was the awful pictures of someone's bruised face and so on. Don't see that sort of much of stuff around them anymore, do we? Crime isn't not sexy at the moment, really, is it, too much? But it does bubble up periodically. And what I want to do tonight, and as Graham has said, is explore if there's a distinctive position for the left in relation to criminal justice and the criminal justice system. And if there is, how can it realistically be progressed? My concern is, I'll come out and say, I don't think we have got a distinctive position. When I've listened when he was Shadow Home Secretary to Sadiq Khan, I listened to Dan Jarvis. I haven't heard the current person. I wasn't hearing a lot of vision. Wasn't hearing anything very exciting or very radical. But there are indications, and I think that's the challenge in the question tonight, that there has been vision on the right. And believe it or not, people on the right have done things. So let's have a look at that. And it is partly deliberately provocative. When I mention left and right, we could use words like liberal and conservative. And if we were in the States, and I'm going to draw on some stuff from the States. Interesting at this time. Liberal and conservative, left and right. We can get into semantics, I know, about those divisions. But maybe we should also use the word radical when we talk about any particular changes or any particular position. Just one health warning, really, and it's inevitable, really, isn't it, that you're going to have some figures thrown at you tonight. They are illustrative. They're not something that you need to absorb and take in and examine, because lots of figures around, I think, in relation to crime and the criminal justice system are probably more indicative and illustrative than that they're something that we need to, to pull apart in a lot of detail, but what one could. Okay, so what are we talking about tonight? Criminal justice system. Criminal justice system, very broadly, what does it do? It investigates, it tries, punishes, and rehabilitates people who are convicted or suspected of committing crime. That's what we're talking about. It's a huge system. We're talking about the police, aren't we? We're talking about the Crown Prosecution Service, the courts and the court system, probation, prisons, and standing alongside them, we've got the youth justice system, which sits alongside slightly differently. And we also have to take into account victims and witnesses, and the law, lawyers and legal aid. I mean, all of those things, when we're talking about the criminal justice system, it's all of those things. It's huge. So it's quite difficult. I'm probably going to focus down on particular areas, but let's just keep that in mind when we talk about that system. And we know that there are technically three government departments responsible, don't we? The Home Office for the police, the Ministry of Justice for courts, for the courts, for probation, for prisons, for youth justice, and so on. Technically, the Crown Prosecution Service is an agency and a ministry in its own right, in a peculiar constitutional way. But I mean, in a way, refers to the Attorney General. Okay, so what are the headlines? What are what I've called the cliches, or perhaps we could also say what's the bad news, really, about criminal justice at the moment? Well, and I say cliches, what we know is across that board, that whole board that I've just laid out, all those agencies, that since 2010-11, surprise, surprise, expenditure is down by 25%. That's the scale of the cuts in real terms, savings that have been made in terms of from austerity. I mean, they're very close to each other. I mean, that seems to be the courts 26, police 25, prisons and probation 24, and so on. May 2016, Public Accounts Committee, and I'll quote them, says, the criminal justice system is close to breaking point. The system's already overstretched, and we consider that the Ministry of Justice, and this was with a particular focus on the courts, has exhausted the scope to make more cuts without further detriment to performance. So that was the Public Accounts Committee. I mean, in recent months, I guess the headlines have been roused on prisons, haven't they? I mean, we've had some problems in the autumn in prisons, disruption. But more significantly, and that was being flagged up during the year, and has been a concern of the present government, rates of violence and self-harm have increased significantly, in fact in recent years in prisons. In the last 12 months, assaults on staff up 43%. Self-harm was increased by over 25%. Self-inflicted deaths up by 13% in the 12 months to last September. It's a difficult situation in prisons at the moment, with 30% less staff. I mean, that's what's been happening. That's what's been happening over the last few years. And what that led to, those real concerns had led to a white paper from the government, which Michael Gove was about to bring out. He was pretty brave to say those things in the Tory party conference in some ways, I think. Put off when Liz Truss has become Minister of Justice. But an out it has come, called Prison Safety and Reform. I mean, just hold with that title. It's Prison Safety and Reform. Nothing about whether prisons are any use. Prison Safety and Reform. And we're going to have an extra 2,500 prison officers, having secured just over £100 million to employ more prison officers. Well, okay, so we think about prisons and what they might be doing. And I'm coming back to the National Audit Office, who looked some years ago, 2010, estimated the cost to the economy of reoffending of those released from custody. This was back in 2010. And the current government has said, well, we need to bring those costs up to date. At that stage, it was something between about 9 and 12 billion pounds a year, the cost of reoffending. Now you think, how can it be that in terms of what people lose? We've got to think about court costs, on costs, damage to people, insurance claims, all sorts of things. I must say, it's a staggering figure, isn't it? A staggering figure. And the current government's own figure, and it's in the white paper, says the costs of the reoffending now should be put at, and this is just people coming out of custody, at around, I mean, these are big estimates, I know, £15 billion a year. I mean, I couldn't believe it when I read it, I have to say. I mean, I thought, surely it can't be that high. But they've gone back, checked with the National Audit Office, yes, £15 billion a year. In the white paper, it says, we will never be able to address the issue of reoffending if we don't address the current level of violence and safety in our prisons. And that's why I am, this is Liz Truss, determined to make prisons work. You may have heard that phrase before, actually, about prisons working. Well, the reoffending rate, well-known figure, for people serving under 12 months, it's been for a number of years at about 66% of people reoffend within 1 year of coming out of prison if they've served a sentence of less than 12 months, which is the bulk of people who go into prison. And prisons cost £3 billion a year to run. £3 billion a year to run. Just stay with those figures for a moment. Costs £3 billion a year to run prisons. People come out of prisons, and the cost of the economy is £15 billion for reoffending. We'll just hold those figures for now. So that's prisons. That's been a lot around about then. Just talking about courts, if we looked across that particular area, I'll just throw some things at you. But I mean, they give you a feeling of what's been happening again in the last 5 years or so. 2/3 of trials in the Crown Court that go to Crown Court now are delayed because of various sorts of delays. They don't start on time. 2/3 of those listed for Crown Court. There's currently a backlog of some 60,000 cases at the Crown Court. They should be there. There's a backlog in trying to get them into the system. And that's been increasing. Year on year, that number has been increasing. Clearly, court time is wasted with parties who've simply not done what they should have done. 2015 CPS inspection. 38% of cases that came to the Crown Court that had come to court had not been effectively reviewed by the Crown Prosecution Service. This is members of the Crown Prosecution Service flying by the seat of their pants in court, having got papers on the day. Have the Crown Prosecution Service had any more staff? No, it's the same story. They've got less staff and they've been cut. Victims and witnesses. Great phrase. Over the years, Labour ministers, Tory ministers, you've heard it before, we must put the victims at the heart of the criminal justice system. Just heard it yesterday, Theresa May talking about mental health. Last thing she said as her Home Secretary at the last Tory party conference about victims being at the heart of the criminal justice system. Recent review and survey of victims have said that 55% of them would not choose to be a victim. Certainly they'd be a victim, but to be a witness again. If they were a victim, to be a witness, or to be a witness, would not be a witness again because of the experience that they've had. In terms of delays, in terms of the poor information that they get, but particularly in terms of frustrations with delays. Victims and witnesses now probably have to wait something like, on average, 4 or 5 months, really, from hearing that a case is going to go ahead to actually appearing in court. And that's a difficult situation to run through. Hardly something about putting victims and witnesses at the heart of the criminal justice system. A lot of them wouldn't want to do it again. Now, quite a bit of that is structural problems. I mean, it's a difficult old system because you've got different organisations, haven't you? You've got police, you've got CPS, you've got the court service. All of these things have to be integrated, and they all have an effect on one another. I mean, one of the effects, for example, for the CPS has been that the cutbacks in the forensic science services have meant that the CPS arrive and look at a case and say, yeah, but we haven't got all the evidence here. We need forensics. Where's the forensics? Well, we don't have a national forensic service anymore because it's been contracted out and one thing and another. Difficult bits in the system because one bit of the system has to save money, it affects another bit of the system. But it's difficult. Access to justice, legal aid. Any idea of how much that's been cut? By 1/3 in the last 2 or 3 years. legal aid has been cut by 1/3. Now, in fact, in terms of the criminal courts, the effect hasn't been as great as it's been in the civil courts, and you've heard about the civil courts probably, the very, very significant increase in people who are now representing themselves because they can't afford or cannot get access to a lawyer. Knock-on consequence, cases take longer, costs go up, cases get delayed, and so it goes on. But of course, it's what's been introduced into legal aid is competitive tendering, because that's going to save us money. So we cut money, but we're also saving money. In fact, fair to Michael Gove, Chris Grayling's proposal was for this last year to cut legal aid again and fees to criminal legal aid services by 8%. And Gove, to his credit, said, we're not going down that road, I am not going to make those cuts. They've been made somewhere else, of course. So that's part of the pictures that we've got. We're just looking across the system. The other big, I guess, couple of themes that have been around have been, number one, tendering, and of course putting services out to private tendering, and payment by results. Major drives by the current administration. I say by the current administration, because here again, maybe I'm coming back to the left. This wasn't started by the Tories. This was started by a Labour government. Privatisation of prisons and looking at privatising and tendering out parts of the probation service. That was not something which was started by a Conservative government. It was started by the Labour government. But the targets have been prisons and probation. And in a sense, one of the reasons for doing that, and in fairness, one could almost say, is not just to save costs, but also to try and break monopolistic thinking. Because, I mean, I think we might agree that monopolies are not always such a good thing, really. One tends to get into bureaucratic mode, get into defensive thinking mode, to get defensive about criticism. And I think quite genuinely, to some extent, the idea of introducing independent organisations, private organisations in, would say, we need fresh ideas, we need fresh thinking. Okay? That was one thing. But it was also about managing costs. Interestingly, on that, Crispin Blunt, when he was responsible, and he was in the Ministry of Justice just a couple of years ago, talked about payment by results, which he says is absolutely the right approach in criminal justice. I do accept we don't know how to make it happen. I think, oh, that's an interesting position to have. But they have trialled it a bit in prisons. They have trialled it a bit in prisons in Peterborough and in Doncaster. They're trialling payment by results. The aim being you get a certain amount of money up front for the prison, the organisations that run it, private organisations, and they will then get topped up their final amount of money once people have remained out of trouble for 12 months after release. I mean, that's sort of the way it works. It's about success. You get payment by the results.
The prisons
by
get
people
that
not
money.
offended. The prisons will get it. But they won't get their full cost until those people have succeeded in 12 months crime-free when they come out. But it's a very difficult system to work, and they're still tinkering around with it. But then the government turned its attention to the probation service and made a decision, no, we won't trial it, we'll just do it. And that's what they've done. And as you may know, that what's happened in probation is, and we have got these lovely titles, don't we? It's been called Transforming Rehabilitation. You all probably remember the probation service, probation officers and so on, and there they were a few years ago, and you had a local probation committee and latterly a local probation trust. We had the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Probation Trusts. There were 42 of these trusts in the country. Effectively, I mean public bodies. That's now been broken up. As you may well know, we've now broken it into two bits, probation. So in fact, there is no longer a probation service. There is something called the National Probation Service, which supervises high-risk offenders. Okay, but people are sanctified as high-risk offenders. And that's a national organisation, and it's run from the centre. Very bureaucratic outfit, I can tell you. I mean, certainly people I know who are working, but they manage high-risk offenders. And that's about 25% of the caseload of people under supervision. And people under supervision, I mean, placed on community orders by the courts, or have come out of prison and they're on licence and they're on supervision. So National Probation Service is made to high risk. The medium and low risk, the other 75% of people, whether they're placed on probation, on community orders by the courts, or whether they've come out of prisons, are supervised by private organisations. Have you heard of them? Community Rehabilitation Companies, CRCs. There's 21 of them in the country, and what the government did was divide up the country and say, that's the service we want, who's going to make a bid to provide the services that we want? And there was a competitive tendering for it. So great organisations like G4S, like Interserve, which is a multinational, they have their little organisations locally with different titles. I mean, you may have heard of Interserve. I mean, it's a massive multinational organisation. In this area, Interserve is responsible, except it's an outfit called Purple Futures, which is a made-up name, really, isn't it? Just as a what I'd probably cynically call a front organisation. But there are 20... Yes. Well, now there are early days for these community rehabilitation companies. I mean, they've only been around really since June 1914. So we're not... 1914. 2014. 1914. But we've had the latest report on a community rehabilitation company. It came out on the 16th of December. It was about North London. Let me quote you from the Chief Inspector of Probation. Probation services in North London have deteriorated, and the work by the community rehabilitation company responsible for managing low and medium risk offenders is poor. People are more at risk as a result. This is unacceptable. Now, actually, all the reports have not been as bad, and it is early days, but this is an indicator. The reports are not good by a Magistrates Inspector of Probation on CRCs. I just think of, you're dealing sometimes with high-risk offenders, people who do pretty nasty and horrible things at various times, and there are victims of those cases. Now, in any report on serious offending, every time something happens, certainly within the probation sphere, there will be there'll be an inspection and there will be a look at this. The situation will be reviewed. And let me also let you think of names like Victoria Climbier, Baby P, right? Every time, I know some of you in this room may have been familiar with this, every time there's been an inquiry, there's been one common theme that's run through all of those, and that's the issue of communication between agencies. Poor communication, difficulties. And what do we do in relation to probation service? We break it up and we fragment it. And I can tell you that, talking to people, even in the same building, they're not even running the same communication computer system. They've had real problems just talking to each other, and that's people working in the same building. It feels like a disaster waiting to happen, doesn't it, really, in many respects. Okay, that's throwing that to you. Oh, I guess the other thing just to mention about that is that the National Probation Service has been centralised, and it is very centralised. I was talking to a local manager just before Christmas and says, I've never seen my senior manager. My senior manager, I work in Southampton, is in Weston-super-Mare. So funny old regions National Probation Service has. But there is something about, isn't there, justice and things happening locally. I mean, I think it's just this contrast between centralisation and localism, really, but it's moved very much that way. And community rehabilitation companies are not publicly accountable. Where's the local committee to which they account locally? There isn't one, because they account directly up to something called the National Offender Management Service, which sits in the Ministry of Justice. There is no local involvement now in any of these organisations that relate to probation services, which we wish there were. Police, I just mentioned in passing, you'll know, 18% cut in the past 5 years. We've got 17,000 less police officers than we had sort of 5 years ago, something like that. Mind you, you might say, Theresa May would be saying, yes, but are they all doing police work? And I'll come on to that in due course. Okay, so it's grim, isn't it? I mean, it's feeling, and that may be familiar stuff that you've heard. Could I just mention, just in that context, about youth justice and about youth crime as well? I mean, do people know what the story of that is? Anyone know what the story of that is? Well, it's good news, because I'm now going to move on away from the bad news to the better news. crime is down. Police recorded crime has consistently been dropping probably since the early 2000s.
But other words, police recorded.
Police recorded crime, yes. The other major survey which the government has gone by are victim surveys, and that is the Crime Survey of England and Wales, which has been running now since the early 1980s. And every year a representative sample of the adult population are interviewed about their experience of being victims of crime. Okay? And it's a highly regarded survey. And the drop, and it peaked, I mean the figures were going up. Crime was going up, certainly, until you get up to 1994, 95. Okay? If you look at the graph, in terms of the British Crime Survey, which is the figures for that are way above police recorded crime. We're talking about 3 times as much projected, estimated experience of victimisation than actually crimes that have been reported to the police. The crime survey indicates much higher figures, but that graph has been coming down. Let me just read you this from the base report. Figures for the year to June 16, the Crime Survey of England and Wales showed at least 7 million adults aged 16 or over were a victim of at least one crime. But the likelihood of being a victim of crime has fallen significantly over time. In 1995, and this is just done on the stats, 40 in 100 people were a victim of crime, reported being a victim of crime. March 2006, 23 people in 100 reported being a victim of crime on the crime survey. Last year, 15 in 100 reported it. You look at any graph on crime, what's been happening in the last few years, it's been coming down. Just offer that. Youth offending, youth justice. Arrests, I'll give you these figures. I mean, this is from the Youth Justice Board latest annual report. Arrests of young people fell between March 14 and March 15 by 13%. Arrests of young people fell by 13 and 14%. The peak year was the year ending March 2007. Since that peak, arrests of young people committing crime has dropped by, wait for it, 66%. That's staggering, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is remarkable.
You trust it.
Proven offences. This is offences for which people are arrested and it's been established they've committed the offences. Down by 70% since March 2005. Cautions down 81%. Not a lot of people know that. The youth justice system may well be a remarkably successful bit of work in this country. Does anyone ever hear about that? No. Both governments have been committed to what the youth justice system has done over the last few years. Kicked off by the last Labour administration, continued by the coalition government, and continued on by the present government.
Just remind us what a youth is for this purpose.
Under 18, 17 and below. 17 and below.
Older than?
Older than 10. Thank you for that. Yep. Age of criminal responsibility is 10. Then so it's up to the age of 17. Those are quite remarkable figures, and a major commitment to keeping young people out of the criminal justice system and saying, we're not going to deal with you as criminals, we're going to say, we've got a behaviour problem here, let's deal with the behaviour, let's deal with what you've done, not necessarily get the sticky fingers of the criminal justice system on you and label you as an offender. That's been quite something over the last few years. Now, of course, crime figures going down, it could well be, and he has said it within the last few months, Michael Howard, it proves that prison works, because prison figures haven't gone down. They've been flatlining, but they haven't gone down. That's something that certainly bobs up every now and again. Well, between 1951 and 1971, prison numbers in England and Wales doubled. I know this is a long time ago. What happened to crime? Went up. It trebled. Numbers in prisons doubled. Crime trebled. Doesn't seem much relationship between crime going down and sticking people inside, does there? 1971 to 1991, Prison numbers remained largely unchanged. Recorded crime continued to go up. Prison numbers have flatlined in recent years. Crime has been going down. There's no necessarily crude relationship between the number of people in prisons and what happens to crime. In fact, we'd certainly, if we were doing a criminology session, say there is no relationship whatsoever. In fact, what's happening to crime hasn't really, frankly, got a lot to do with sentencing, with prisons, or with anything else. It's got to do with other things in society. So it's simplistic. Now, you say, oh, come on, you're just throwing around a load of figures. Well, that trend is the same in North America and Western Europe. Police recorded crime, victim surveys in all of those countries, crime rates is going down. And they have been going down over the last 10 and 15 years. The Netherlands have closed 24 prisons since 2014. Now, they're not very big prisons, not in the size of the Wandsworths of these worlds, with 1,000, or so more in, and so on. But between 2011 and 2015, the Dutch prison population's gone down by over 25%. The crime rate has continued to drop by, according to their reports, by 1% a year. What they've done is they've switched to community-based sentences. They've used technology. The ankles, the tagging, and so on and so forth. Similar to over here, 55% drop in the number of under 17-year-olds put in youth detention, but crime has gone down. Holland now has a very low incarceration rate, 57 out of 100,000 citizens imprisoned in any 1 year. Finland's the lowest at 54. Guess who's the highest? At 148. Nothing like the States, of course, where the last estimate it's about 690, but there you are. That is a democratic libertarian, isn't it? It's all about freedom, isn't it? Well, freedom for some anyway. It's a cynical remark. Germany, anywhere else in Europe you'll see crime figures have gone down. So it's a funny old picture really, isn't it? But one of the just interesting little things is, in looking at the Dutch reports, since 2008, and you've certainly had this figure of crime going down, feelings of safety or feelings of insecurity have been rising. It's a peculiar thing about crime is that people's general feelings of security, feelings of safety, have been declining. I mean, people are feeling less secure, but yet the crime rate has been going down. Odd sort of divergence there, isn't there? You'd think, well, necessarily the two things to go together, but they don't appear to do so. So, I mean, what's all that about? Crime going down? Because we're saying it's nothing to do with prisons. And maybe we do have to look wider at certain wider things in society. Some of you may hear, you might be surprised I don't go to nightclubs. That may surprise you when you look at me, because I'm a pretty groovy sort of looking character. Some of you may. One of the reasons I can't go now is the number of nightclubs in the last 5 years has halved. Now, there's also maybe all sorts of reasons for that, but one of the other things in social surveys is that young people don't go out as much. Where does most crime occur? It doesn't occur in the home. It occurs when people go out. People don't go out as much. Now, there could be a whole variety of reasons for that. I'm talking rather generally here. But one of the latest social behaviour surveys is that the proportion of 16 to 24-year-olds who are teetotal in the last few years has increased quite significantly when they've done surveys. Compared with 3 or 4 years ago, it's 40% greater. Between 2005 2014, by 2013, a quarter of young people under 25 say they're not drinking at all. They're teetotal. They're not drinking. Use of drugs in every survey of drug uses is going down. You know, we were worried about what are young people coming to today. Well, those indicators are quite interesting, aren't they? 10 to 15-year-old crime down. And quite seriously, one of the interpretations of that is, and just imagine this is a mobile phone. How do I meet my friends? Now, when I was a 10 to 15-year-old and wanted to meet my mates, what did I do? I went round and knocked on the door. because we didn't have a phone at home, but even when we did have a phone, you'd still probably tend to, how do you meet your friends these days? You don't need to do that anymore. You don't need to do that anymore. You don't need to go out. You don't need to hang around, because you can hang around in different ways. Now that may seem, you might think, what are you talking about? But quite seriously, people interpreting behaviour of people now are saying this may well be related to issues to do with crime. Certain sorts of crime, that is. Street crime, crime outside, you know. People live lives differently. So maybe interpretations of why crime rates are going down isn't to do with something that we're morally much better, but the way we live our lives is different now. It's an interesting way, and it's something one could explore further if we were in another setting. I have to say, it just did remind me, and I hope just bear with me for one section of this. I went to a boys' grammar school, not a great grammar school, went to speech day. I always remember the first speech day I went to. And we had someone from the United Nations Association came, and what they always do is they tell a joke, don't they, at the beginning, There's a bunch of 900 lads sitting there listening to someone telling a joke. But it was good, actually. And it was because the speaker was concerned whether the press was at the meeting. And he said, because one of my concerns with the press is how the press reports things. And he said, because I'm reminded of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and I'm talking about, I was at school just at the end of the 1950s, so this was in the 1950s, but the Archbishop of Canterbury had gone to New York. And he'd come off the aeroplane and walked down the gangway, and the press immediately came round, as they would in those days. There wasn't the same sort of security. The first question he got was, "Hey, Bishop, are you going to any nightclubs while you're in New York?" So he said, "Are there nightclubs in New York?" Headlines the first day. Bishop's first question, "Are there any nightclubs in New York?" Which just reminded me of the nightclubs. So, there we are. There's a picture. It's a confusing, isn't it? It's a difficult picture to sort of get hold of. So, let me turn now to the Conservatives, and I mean that with a small c, Conservatives. As I said, criminal justice reformers like to say, if a Conservative is a Liberal who has been mugged, a Liberal is a Conservative who served time. And there's some truth in that, really. And I want to tell you about a man called Pat Nolan, who was the leader of the Republican minority in the California State Assembly in the late 1980s and 1990s, who described himself as, when he went in, as an earnest law and order conservative, pro-death penalty, pro-cop. That's where he stood. He was hardline on it. The unfortunate Pat Nolan got prosecuted as part of an FBI sting operation in the mid-1990s. It was a result of really doing deals with people to effect legislation and getting contributions to the Republican Party. And he put his hands up to things, and he served 33 months inside in prison. He was imprisoned in the mid-1980s. And what he says of himself is, I emerged no less conservative from that prison from when I went in, except I had around me young men, young black men, young poor black men, infirm men, men with no skills and men with no training. Incarcerating people who aren't a physical threat to society is expensive and counterproductive. And this is Pat Nolan. Only a nation that's rich and vindictive would do this. Pat Nolan said he remained a conservative in many of his values. I mean, we can argue about the toss about what the details of that is, but he said this does not make sense. And he was given a job when he came out, and he was given a job at something called the Justice Foundation, which was looking at reform in prisons in the States, and in fact the criminal justice system. The man who got him the job was called Charles Colson. Now, some of you here will remember this from Watergate. Chuck Colson served 7 months inside, as an aide to President Nixon, and so on. He was one of the Watergate gang. But he took up that work, and Pat Nolan has lobbied for over those years, and still does today, in relation to issues to do with criminal justice and access to justice. And I'm just going to summarise really what the sorts of stands that he's got. And that is, we should, and we may have heard this from elsewhere, we should reserve costly prison space for dangerous offenders. Okay. We should fill inmates' day with productive activities, shades of Michael Gove. We should facilitate victim-offender dialogue. And here he's talking about restorative justice. The business of saying, hang on, if someone's done something to someone, do we get the courts involved in it, or should we have a system which actually seeks to repair that damage between the victim and the offender where that's acceptable to the victim? That's important. We should match offenders with mentors. People shouldn't be left alone when they come out, but with mentors. Provide opportunities for reparation in some way. That links to restorative justice. And we should coordinate re-entry supervision and services for offenders. The system should be more transparent and accountable. There should be greater chances for rehabilitation. There should be a voice for crime victims. And there should be a preference for solutions based on families and communities. Again, let's not take things out and away and bureaucratise criminal justice, but let's see how much victims can feel better as a result if there's the opportunities of things happening. And again, where offenders may face victims, again, where that's appropriate. But most of all, saying we've got to have a system that's cost effective, because this system is not cost effective. And let me just take you back to, in this country, a prison service costing £3 billion a year and reoffending costing £15 billion a year of the people who come out of prison in any 1 year. Is that a cost effective system? Who else has joined? And Justice Foundation, and they've set up something called, and I just quote it, it's called Right on Crime. Interesting title, isn't it? A movement called Right on Crime, which coordinates conservatives in relation to criminal justice. Joining them has been a man called Newt Gingrich. Mm-hmm. You might remember he wrote a book in 1994 called Contractor for America, which was unforgiving in terms of anti-crime provisions. But what does Newt Gingrich say? It's stunningly stupid to have a system that keeps returning people to jail. And I'll throw one other name at you. Texas Governor Rick Perry. Man who was hoping to be the Republican nominee, wasn't he? In 2007, he took an initiative to cancel the expansion of the state prison service in Texas and redirect those savings to addiction treatment. By 2013, or in 2013, closed 3 prisons in Texas. Now, Texas, mind you, had a lot of prison places, enormous. And it is at the lower end of the market, okay, we're talking about that. But, could well be argued, Rick Perry's done something. And that's in the face of, sort of conservative, fundamentalist thinking that, that can be around. And given that, one of the things we might think about is, well, so what's the sell? How on earth can you sell that? Because this hasn't been just in Texas. If I just mention some other states which have closed institutions and redirected, Georgia, South Carolina, Kentucky, Mississippi, have all closed institutions and redirected funding. Now, I'm not saying they're the wonderful places that I'd necessarily want to live with, but that's interesting, isn't it? These are not run by social democratic politicians. These are conservative states. What's been the sell? Well, the big sell has been cost effectiveness. That's what they'll say. There's also, I think, underlining that is there's issues to do with moral beliefs in redemption and some very fundamental issues, in terms of beliefs. But the sell has been about cost effectiveness, as far as they're concerned. Now, of course, what they're not wedded to is probably what some of the things we believe in would be social, economic, cultural and ethnic structures of various sorts. And a woman called Michelle Alexander, who wrote a book called The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colour Blindness. Certainly what she's posited is that the US criminal justice system is the product of economic and social history. When 1/3 of black men in America, black Afro men, will be expected to serve time in an institution at some time in their lives. That's a frightening figure, isn't it? 1/3 of black men destined to spend some time in prison during their life. And as she says, you can't explain that simply as a society defending itself against urban problems. It's no longer concerned primarily with the prevention and punishment of crime, but rather with the management and control of the dispossessed. And yet what Michelle Alexander has said is, she's often found Conservatives more advanced in their thinking than Liberal politicians in the States. Liberal politicians who have to play it tough to get votes, she said. But the problem is, what's happened is, they've become comfortable with the criminal justice system as it is. They don't think radically about it. It's about tinkering around with it. Interestingly, she says, religious conservatives in particular really appreciate the moral and spiritual dimension of mass incarceration. Now, okay, so that's one author. So, are we sort of liberal, left-thinking people effectively just actually quite comfortable with the criminal justice system as it is, and we just tinker about with it? Labour's track record isn't that smart on a criminal justice system. Not in recent years. Arguably, there's nothing visionary about it. And one of the ironies is, maybe, and you might think, well, that's got not much to do with it, is that the current Labour justice policy is that we should get more police on the streets. That's the current, and certainly Jeremy Corbyn has said that. We must get more police on the streets. To do what? What do we want more police on the streets to do? We've just assumed it's a good thing, isn't it? Because it makes us feel all right. But what are they going to do? College of Police research has found 20% of calls to the police are related, under 20% of calls to the police are related to crime. Despite what's been on the health today, the police are often first responders to mental health issues in the community. The police do all sorts of things which aren't necessarily directly related to crime because we don't have other services. What tends to be, if you look at the number of people with mental health problems in prisons, you could well say what we're doing is we're using prisons to deal with our mental health problems. I mean, are we making the proper use of prisons? Are we making the best use of police? Maybe we should raise our eyes that bit higher. We know that in societies, we look at Scandinavia, we look elsewhere, where there is greater equality, there is less crime, there are less people in prisons. It seems to be a function of those societies. That healthy societies have less crime, they have less people in prison. So that's where we should be looking. So maybe the questions we must ask ourselves is, why build more prisons? Why improve, just seek to build more prisons? The Labour position has been we should replace these awful Victorian monstrosities that we have. Well, why are we replacing them? Why aren't we closing them? Why don't we direct some of this money from prisons? Just £3 billion a year. We could redirect that money in the way that they've done, ironically, in places like Texas and in Georgia and elsewhere. We haven't had the guts to do it, maybe, in this country. £15 million of reoffending a year against 3 million we're spending on prisons. We're distancing justice from communities in many ways. Why can't we look more radically at ways in which we can have justice coming down locally? And there's been some experiments with that, problem-solving calls. Why can't we bring back oversight of community supervision right back into communities? In a sense, involve even local authorities in that in some sort of way. We're pushing it away, right at the moment. And clearly striving for a more equal society in the way that, the things that we believe in would be appropriate as well. It does take you back to what Tony Blair said, that to be effective, it's about being tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. But maybe what we have to do is think radically. We've got to be brave. But it is crazy to just improve our prison system. I mean, arguably one of the things we must do is shut down whole parts of it, redirect those resources, because it just cost effectively makes so much sense. And I just leave you with that. It's not being done in this country. It wasn't done by the left in this country. It's been done to some extent by the right in the States, which is an uncomfortable feeling for me, and I'll leave it there, Graham.
Good, thank you for that. That was clearly a tour de force, and Bernard, you